Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.
Welcome to Northern Lights. I was both touched and frankly very grateful to be asked to interview a dear friend, Patricia Johnston, the publisher and the director of the Afton Historical Society Press, what I regard as one of the great success stories of the book world. My name is Tom Loome. I'm an antiquarian bookseller from Stillwater, Minnesota. So I live just a few miles up the St. Croix River from Pat Johnston here in Afton. Some years ago, well, more than a few years ago, when I was first learning the book trade, and that was in Great Britain. It was, I suppose, in the late 1960s, over 30 years ago. And a bookseller whom I much admired, when I was about to come back to the United States, he said he wanted to give me some advice. And his advice is germane to the story of the Afton Historical Society Press. This bookseller, who was an old man at the time, said, "Tom, I just want you to remember one thing. If you're going to be a bookseller, it's the key to success. Most booksellers don't get it. It's imperative that you understand. And this is my advice." And I listened very, very attentively. And his advice was this: "Tom, 90% of books should have stayed trees." And I didn't fully understand that at the time. 90% of books should have stayed trees. And all he meant was that relatively few books have a claim on the future. Most books have very little, if any, value right from the beginning. So as a second-hand bookseller, I'm always searching for that last 1 out of 10 books, 1 out of 20 books that have some claim upon the future. And when I think of that bit of advice, 90% of books should have stayed trees, and because I think it's true, I'm simply astonished at the achievement of Pat Johnston. Because Pat, I don't think you've ever published a book that should have stayed trees.
Well, thank you.
I think you've published about 30, 35 books so far.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Somewhere in the 30s.
Wrote them, edited them, published them. And I think that's a small miracle. I don't think there's one book that should have stayed trees. They're all good books. And I look upon it, frankly, Pat, as a second-hand bookseller. You and I won't be around 50 years from now, but your books will be. And I think every one of them will be a desirable book on the second-hand antiquarian rare book market. How do you account for having done this? I don't know any other publishers of whom this can be said. How do you account for it?
Gosh, I don't have a clue. I mean, I think we just absolutely do our best to produce the best books we can on regional subjects. And in terms of scholarship, literary value, design, production, and that was the idea behind the Afton Press, that we would produce the best books possible.
And I think you've succeeded.
Thank you.
What was the very first book that came out associated with your name?
The first book that came out with the Afton Press was The Shape of Things, The Art of Francis Lee Jaques. It was a book that I had written for a publisher in South Carolina who was doing a series of books called Masters of the Wild on wildlife painters. The Jaques book was to be number 7 in the series. And this was a very lavish series. These were wonderful full-color books. And he went bankrupt at number 6. So I was left with the manuscript and had collected all the pictures. And it was just an absolutely perfect book to begin what I had been dreaming about, a Minnesota press. to produce this kind of books.
But am I right, there were a lot of books associated with Pat Johnston before that, before the first Afton Historical Society Press?
Yeah. I started publishing my own books in about 1982. Did a book called Stillwater, Minnesota's Birthplace, based on the John Runk collection of historic photographs. And I did 5 books under the Johnston Publishing name. I was writing them, selling them, delivering them to the bookstores, and after 5 books in 4 years, I thought maybe I'm trying to do too many of the book selling things here. I wanted to write more, so then I wrote books for other publishers, things like Minnesota Portrait of the Land and Its People. I think that the last I heard, Random House was distributing that for American Geographic Publishing. Did some private commissions, including a 2-volume history of the Macmillan family in Wayzata, history of the White Bear Yacht Club, things like that. But after a few years of that, I also missed the part about putting books together, really having a say in how the books, how they were edited, how they looked, how they were produced. And so the Afton Press is the result. And it's a nonprofit press, so that we're able to produce very high quality books that don't always make their money back.
How many titles now are in print under the Afton Historical Society
I haven't counted
Press?
lately, but I think about 35, and we have 6 new titles this year, so I'm sure we'll be over 40 by the end of the year.
Now, and it's my impression all of them are regional history, all associated with Minnesota, and a couple a little bit across the river, Wisconsin. But they're mostly Minnesota titles, am I right?
Well, we started out, our mission statement said we would produce books on Minnesota subjects. We've broadened that to regional. One of our recent books, American Ruins by Maxwell Mackenzie, covers photographs from Minnesota, the Dakotas, Iowa, Wisconsin, I think Montana and Idaho. So we are branching out a little bit, but Minnesota is a very nice niche. It's a nice, there's plenty of subject material in Minnesota, and
well, this I'm sure you already know. In my own bookstores in Stillwater, we have a pretty tough rule. We sell only secondhand, out of print, rare antiquarian books, but we do make an exception. And as one walks into the big bookstore on Main Street, we have a big display of every title published by Afton Historical Society, spanking new, and they sell extraordinarily well. There's a world of people interested in regional, local history, and I think yours are the best books in sight.
thank you.
Now, if that's the case, and as a bookseller, I'm convinced that it is, you've committed yourself to, let's say, regional history, Minnesota history. Are your own roots right to the beginning in Minnesota?
Yes, I've always lived here. I've lived in Duluth and Minneapolis and St. Paul, and now Afton for more than 30 years.
What drew you to wee little Afton?
The solitude. and I mean, it's a wonderful place to live. We don't have a gas station or a grocery store, but we're less than a half an hour from the Twin Cities, so we have, and Stillwater, we have everything we need. We have access to the world's culture, and we're out here on the river where it's beautiful and peaceful and quiet.
But you've always been in Minnesota.
Yes.
This your family, it's a straight Minnesota family.
It is, and both my parents lived their whole lives in Minnesota.
Just a question about Afton. This is perhaps pure trivia, but I notice that you have an exceedingly low zip code. Am I right that it's 55001? Yeah, it is the lowest.
And it is, and so
the
then
beginning, it's the beginnings of everything when it comes to Minnesota zip codes. You're number 1.
Yeah.
Well, so also with the press, it's appropriate.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
What led you to select the Afton Historical Society Press as the formal title of your publishing entity? It does catch an awful lot, I must say, those 4 words.
Well, we're not connected to the Afton Historical Society, which is located down the street, but we're friends. And it just seemed like the kind of books that we were going to publish, I had decided we would do Minnesota nonfiction, and titles that I would associate with perhaps the Minnesota Historical Society Press. And so I thought, well, okay, we'll be the Afton Historical Society Press, kind of like David and Goliath, I don't know. But the Minnesota Historical Society has always been very supportive of what we're doing too. They're one of our best customers in their bookstore. We use some of their editors for editing our books.
What roughly is the print run of one of your books? How many are published
Usually
of a given title?
Yeah, between 5,000 and 10,000 is our usual, although some of the books are less.
I had no idea that 5 to 10,000. It seems to me like a colossal number of books.
Colossal number. I don't know. I mean, we did only 3,000 of the Ralph Rapson book, but that sold out. We're getting ready to reprint that now, and we have done reprints on some of our titles.
Is there any particular book that has sold more copies? For all I know, it could be the Stillwater book.
Well, you know, that certainly has sold a lot of
I
copies.
think cumulatively over the years.
Yeah, because Stillwater has been in print since 1982. That was the first book I did for Johnston Publishing, and we revised it, and so it's been in print. It was out of print for a few years, but it's been back in print with Afton now for 7. So that certainly sold a lot of copies. We printed 6,000 the first time as Johnston Publishing and 6,000 as Afton. We still have copies. One book that is selling a lot is Death of the Dream, Farmhouses in the Heartland, because we produced our first documentary based on that book. We co-produced it with TPT, Public Television. And so the documentary has shown on public televisions nationally, won 4 Emmys in the year 2000. And so now, and we reprinted that book in softcover at the same time that the video came out. So I think, so a lot of people know about that book nationally, where mostly we market our books in a more...
Now, are most of your books in the end published both in cloth and paperback, or at least a fair number, in both forms?
We're starting to do more in both forms. We did do mainly cloth in the beginning, but we just find that so many people want soft cover. And I guess I shouldn't call them paperback, because they're very high quality soft cover books with flaps. But we're doing more and more on
Are there any other books besides Death of a Dream that has the video? Or is that a first?
That was the first. But then we followed that up with a second TPT video called, it's co-produced with Twin Cities Public Television, called Seth Eastman Painting the Dakota. And that was based on actually 3 titles that we produced. We did a very large Seth Eastman book. Seth Eastman, A Portfolio of North American Indians, was one of our first titles. We did a book by Mary Henderson Eastman. We reprinted Dakota Life or Legends of the Sioux. And then in year 2000, we did a book called Painting the Dakota, Seth Eastman at Fort Snelling. And that was our first book for young people and adults. Together with the documentary and the 3 books, we also sponsored an exhibition of the Seth Eastman paintings in these books, 56 watercolors, at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian in New York, which the exhibit runs April through October of 2001.
Another, frankly, bookish question, but I'm just curious. Your books are so beautifully produced. Who produces them? Do you have just one printer, one binder, or is each one put out competitively?
No, we have used other printers through the years, but for the last 4 years, I think we've printed with Friesens in Canada, and we're just very pleased with them. And certainly, we do all our design here, and spec out the paper and all the materials. We select all that, but they do a fine job of printing, and we're very happy with them.
Yeah, I'm sure that you're well aware that something that's remarkable, or remarkably consistent in your books, is that as physical objects, they're aesthetically pleasing to the eye, and they have wonderful content too.
Thank you.
And that's very hard to do both. I see an awful lot wonderful books in terms of contents, and one does wish that they had been better designed. Or books beautifully designed, but virtually contentless. And hence my question about the, again, is it the binding is done by a Canadian firm?
The binding is done at Friesens. They print and bind.
They do the whole thing.
Yeah. Although we usually we usually do some hand-bound editions of most of our books, and Greg Campbell Campbell Logan Bindery
Oh, right
binds
in
those
Minneapolis.
for us in Minneapolis.
So Greg Campbell does some
He
of the
does our
hand
limited
binding.
edition books.
What would
Yes.
be an example of a limited edition?
Well, all of John Hassler's books are in limited editions. He did a Christmas book for us, Underground Christmas, and then 2 books of short stories, Keepsakes and Other Stories, and Rufus at the Door and Other Stories. We've just done, we have limited edition books of Painting the Dakota, Max Mackenzie's American Ruins, other ones as well, Carol Bly's Christmas book for us.
Well, I am pleased to know that some of the very best Minnesota books are Minnesota bound.
Yes.
In Minneapolis by Campbell Logan Bindery. Well, that seems only appropriate.
Yeah, it does.
Yes.
Yeah.
Now, it's only when I've come down to the headquarters of the Afton Historical Society Press that another question was partially answered. I've often asked myself, how does Pat Johnston have time to do all this? She must have a big staff. How many people work here?
Well, there are 4 of us part-time and 4 of us full-time. I'm certainly full-time. I could probably count 2 full-time. And 4 full-time, 4 part-time.
And you do all this just with the equivalent of about 6 or 7 people?
Yeah, and we do contract some of our design and editing.
Now here we are in the year 2001, July 2001. What are some of the good things that you have in store for us in the coming months or in the next year or so?
Well, we're just completing a book that we're publishing with the help of St. John's University in Collegeville. It's called Body of Clay, Soul of Fire, Richard Bresnahan and the St. John's Pottery. Richard Bresnahan is a world-class potter trained in Japan who has the largest wood fire kiln in North America. The monks helped him build it at Collegeville. The book is written by Matthew Welch, who's curator of Asian art at the Minneapolis Art Institute. It's an absolutely gorgeous book.
All of your books are gorgeous
thank you.
books.
Thank you. We're doing a book called Ojibwe, We Look in All Directions. That's this coming fall, 2001. It'll be the companion book to a 6-part documentary series, public television series being produced by WDSE in Duluth. Our Christmas book this year will be by Senator Eugene McCarthy. We're doing another book about Ralph Rapson. This one is by Ralph. It's called Ralph Rapson's Sketches and Drawings from Around the World.
So that's 3 or 4 new titles that you rattled on, right?
Those will all be this fall.
Yeah. Now, how hard do you try to become nationally, internationally known? And is it difficult when you're primarily committed to local regional history?
I don't think we have a mission to become nationally known. Some of our books are distributed nationally, and certainly the Seth Eastman things are doing well because we have the Smithsonian exhibition, and it's a subject worthy of international attention. The Death of the Dream is a national book. But our mission was to produce good books on regional subjects, and if they sell outside of our area, fine.
Yeah, yeah. As you look back over all these years, it's coming close to 20 years when you've been involved in writing, editing, publishing. Do you have any regrets? Any opportunities that you missed? Perhaps when you were younger and had more energy, and you may retrospectively look back and, perhaps wish that you had done something differently.
No, I mean, this has all been an absolute dream. I mean, from the time I wrote my first magazine piece 20 years ago, I had no idea. I had no idea that the magazine pieces would lead to books or that it would lead to publishing. It's just been one lucky happenstance after another, I think, that's brought me here.
That again, dear Pat, that's remarkable that not too many regrets as it concerns the publishing and the books. It just has gone from strength to
just
strength.
Gets better.
It just
gets better.
Gets better. Yes.
Yeah.
Now, before I started to interview you, I was thinking to myself, I don't do this professionally. I'm not very good. I'm a little bit nervous. And then you volunteered that you were a little bit nervous. But don't you do this kind of thing a great deal? You must often be asked to talk about your work,
I do. I don't do a lot of television, and I'm fine in front of a group. I didn't used to be, but I've gotten better by having to do it. But you're absolutely wonderful. You ought to have a talk show.
Oh,
you really
no.
are.
This is Amateurville here today. Several years ago, you invited me to a lovely event at the Landmark Center. where all of your books were on display? Are you thinking of doing something like that again? That was a spectacular occasion.
We try to do that once a year for our special friends and customers.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
haven't got anything planned yet this year, but you know, as soon as we get the books out, then we've got to plan the parties to celebrate them.
Now, is your husband Charlie much involved in all this, besides rooting for you? I'm sure he roots for you.
He roots for me. He's not very much involved in the press itself. He's very patient, but he was involved in Johnston Publishing. And he was involved in a lot of my magazine work too. He did a lot of the photography for especially travel pieces and other things. So he's always been supportive.
And it also occurs to me that just to imagine when you say, you know, going from strength to strength, you must have made, over the past 20 years, some wonderful friends in the book world.
Oh, yes. And you're
People
number
whom-
one, Tom.
Yeah, people whom you would have otherwise no access to, but really wonderful
Well,
men and women.
That's really true. I mean,
Bookish,
people
the world
like,
of books.
Yeah, I mean, people like John Hassler, who was my literary hero. You know, I asked him to do a book for us, and now he's done 3. Bill Holm, Carol Bly. Yes, I mean, we've really, and people outside of that in the magazine work. I mean, you had access to everybody: movie stars, presidential campaign candidates, and.
You ask a lot of people to do a lot of things, and mostly they give you a yes as an answer.
They're absolutely
because you couldn't do it by
remarkable.
yourself,
Oh no.
and you must
No.
charm them somehow. But do many people say no?
No,
I
mean,
suppose
I can't believe it.
we ought not to ask for the names, but there has to be someone who says, no, I don't want to do that.
I've never had one.
You're
I've never
kidding.
had one, no. And John Hassler, when I asked him to write our book, Christmas book, well, he got us into fiction because it was a Christmas memoir, it's supposed to be. But he called me before it was finished and he said, Pat, this has turned into a short story, is that okay? And I thought about 1 minute because John hadn't done a short story in 20 years. And I said, yes, John, that'll be fine. And so we met at the Chicago Deli a few weeks later, which is one of his favorite places, and he gave me the manuscript. We hadn't talked about money. And I said, John, our usual advance for these Christmas books is $1,000. And he said, that's okay. And so we paid him his $1,000. And a couple of years later, when he subsequently did a book called Keepsakes and Other Stories for us, and then Rufus at the Door. And when and we did pay him a little bit more. When we were negotiating for Rufus at the Door, he said, you know, Pat, the last advance I had from Valentine was $150,000. But he had been very gracious about doing the book for $1,000, and we certainly didn't come close to Valentine's figure.
Yeah. Well, Pat Friday, that's a great tribute to you, that you ask people to help you, to be associated with you, and they always say yes. That's a terrific compliment.
Oh, it certainly is very nice of them. There's a lot of nice people out there.
No, I'm very fond, and I've come to know the Minnesota book world rather well. It's a great world, committed, intelligent, and increasingly aesthetically, quite distinguished.
Yes.
And I think you've made a great contribution to it. I say that as a bookseller, but I know that there are countless authors who would second that. It's a great contribution to the Minnesota book world. So on behalf of myself, on behalf of all bookish people, wherever they may be, I want to thank you very much. So it was a delight to interview today Patricia Condon Johnston, publisher and director of the Afton Historical Society Press, and a great success story in Minnesota publishing.
We founded the Afton Historical Society Press in 1994. It's a 501c3 nonprofit organization which allows us to do some really wonderful books. The idea behind the press was that we would produce the best books that we could on Minnesota subjects in terms of scholarship, literary value, design, production. We work with absolutely the best historians, authors, designers, editors. The very first book that Afton produced was a book called The Shape of Things, The Art of Francis Lee Jacques. The first, and in my opinion, the best of the wildlife painters. It was my own book. It was a book that I'd written for another publisher that went bankrupt, and it was an absolutely perfect book with which to launch a new Minnesota press. Our most popular book in the year 2000 was Tony Anderson's Small Town Minnesota A to Z. And it's an absolutely wonderful book. The criteria was that these towns have no more than 1,000 people, and that they be spread out evenly throughout the state. He's taken one town named with A, Argyle, and goes on from there. Minnesota Impressionists is one of my favorite books. There weren't any artists called Minnesota Impressionists before we published this book. I mean, certainly the artists had done their work, but nobody had called them Minnesota Impressionists. So I spoke with Rena Cohn one day, and Rena is a leading Minnesota art historian, and she went ahead and wrote it for us, and the book includes artists that were directly influenced by the French Impressionists. So we have 3 books by Paul Clifford Larson, who is a world-class architectural historian. The first book that he did for us was Clarence Johnston, Minnesota architect. Clarence Johnston was the most prolific Minnesota architect, a friend and colleague of Cass Gilbert's. Paul went on to do a book for us called Icy Pleasures, which examines how Minnesotans celebrate winter. Paul did a 3rd book called A Place at the Lake, which he said is the antidote to the Icy Pleasures book. So this examines how Minnesotans spend their time at the lake, whether in a small cabin or in a very palatial house. And this Christmas books is a series. The idea there was that we would produce a holiday memoir by a significant Minnesota writer each year. So we have John's Underground Christmas. Bill Holm wrote Faces of Christmas Past for us. Carol Bly wrote an Adolescence Christmas. In the year 2000, Jerry Fearing, who is the legendary cartoonist, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, did Christmas on West 7th Street, where he grew up in St. Paul. I should also mention our Books for Schools program. One of our most recent books, Painting the Dakota, is our first book for young people. With the help of private individuals and foundations and corporations, we're putting a package into Minnesota schools. The idea behind the Painting the Dakota book is that we're trying to teach Dakota culture through the Seth Eastman paintings. So we at the Afton Historical Society Press are absolutely delighted to be doing this kind of work, and hope to be able to continue to produce really significant books on Minnesota history and culture.
Northern Lights, a look at Minnesota books and writers, is presented by the Minnesota Center for the Book, a program of the Minnesota Humanities Commission, with funding provided by Target Stores and the Elmer L. and Eleanor J. Anderson Foundation.